Joining us now, we have MS Now's David Noriega reporting from Jerusalem, Nicholas Kristof, New York Times columnist and author, and Richard Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, former managing editor for Time magazine, and an MS Now political analyst. Welcome to all three of you. So, David, Iran issued a pretty stark threat if the U.S. moves forward with ground invasion plans, saying it's going to set American troops on fire. Meanwhile, Trump says the U.S. is in serious discussions with a new and more reasonable regime. What do we know about the talks, how specific these talks are, or if they're being done through proxies, and who these more reasonable people might be?
We know very little, Alex, and it's now been about a week of this same dynamic playing out where we hear from Trump and various Trump administration officials about these negotiations ostensibly taking place, but we don't actually know who the negotiations are taking place with. It does seem to be the case that that Pakistan is acting as an intermediary in some kind of talks between Washington and Tehran. But again, given how much of the Iranian political and military leadership has been killed in this war, it is not clear what this new regime is that Trump is envisioning when he says that there has already been regime change. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was pressed on this question this morning on Good Morning America. Listen to a little bit of what he said.
Who is this new and more reasonable regime? Is the United States in direct contact with them?
Well, I'm not going to disclose to you who those people are because it probably would get them in trouble with some other groups of people inside of Iran. Look, there's some fractures going on there internally. And at the end of the day, I think that if there are people in Iran who now, given everything that's happened, are willing to move in a different direction for their country, that would be great. We have to see if these people end up being the ones in charge, seeing if they're the ones that have the power to deliver. We're going to test it. We are hopeful that that's the case.
I want to point out, Alex, also that the threats that Donald Trump is using to underpin these negotiations, the threats of, at large scale bombing Iranian energy and other infrastructure, the general consensus among experts in international humanitarian law is that those kinds of attacks on civilian infrastructure are unlawful. So it remains to be seen whether those attacks actually take place. In the meantime, today, MS Now got a statement from a spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry pretty harshly rejecting the notion that they might be negotiating with the United States and rejecting the notion that the United States might be conducting these negotiations in good faith. In that statement, this spokesperson said that they do not evaluate the claims of the United States honestly. They say that they have experience in flesh and blood that they characterize as a betrayal that's been committed twice during negotiations. What he was referring to, of course, is the fact that this war is not the first, but actually the second time that Iran has been bombed by Israel in the United States in the midst of negotiations with those countries over its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, and so on. The first instance having been last year during the so-called June War, when Israel and subsequently the United States bombed Tehran and other locations in Iran, again, during the course of negotiations over the issues that underpin this entire conflict, Alex.
Okay, David Noriega, thanks so much. I know you have more reporting to get to, so we will pivot now to Nick. In a new interview with the Financial Times, the president was pretty blunt about his priorities, saying, "My favorite thing is to take the oil in Iran, but some stupid people back in the U.S. say, 'Why are you doing that?' But they're stupid people." So, Nick, is that what this is all about at the root of it?
I mean, no, I think it's about more than that. But that does underscore the delusion with which I think the administration is pursuing. It's not going to be able to seize Iranian oil. It's not going to be able to take that. I mean, look, it could take Harg Island, but it would be incredibly difficult to hold it. It would lose a lot of American troops along the way. And the Iranian response would be to attack oil and gas infrastructure around the region and perhaps desalination plants in ways that would create a long-term disaster and send oil prices soaring much higher. So when Trump talks about seizing Iranian oil, there's not a plausible path to do that. If they tried more plausibly to seize it outside the Strait of Hormuz in tankers, then Iran would stop shipping out oil and oil prices would again start soaring. There's, And when Trump talks about how there's regime change, I mean, he has a point, but the regime change is to a government that is harder to align, more militaristic, more led by the IRGC, and less willing to make concessions.
Yeah, that's a sobering concept. So, Richard, Trump also said that Iran was going to let 20 oil ships through the strait as a sign of respect. So doesn't that also indicate how much power Iran still has to control the traffic in the strait? And by the way, is it a sign of respect if those ships, those 20 that will be allowed through, don't directly benefit the U.S. supply?
Yes, Alex, it's like a king and his court saying that people are paying respect to him. That seems to be what Trump wants. Again, we have no evidence that that's even true. Just like we have no evidence that the president is negotiating with anybody or that there's been regime change. I mean, you know, we've been at this for years and years. And the fact that once again, we try to take Trump at his word and try to figure out, is there some reality that this corresponds to, seems to be a bad endeavor. But he doesn't have a plan. And, you know, I would say part of the reason he's saying that we need to negotiate is because almost everything that he has done has fallen flat and been a mistake. The incredible rise in oil prices, which triggers rises in prices everywhere, that increases inflation. He's feeling the economic pain, and you know, if he now seizes on this idea of actually taking the oil, something, by the way, he talked about back in the Iraq War in the early 2000s, that also seems like a really dangerous thing to even talk about.
Mm-hmm. In a new opinion piece, Nick, you write, old men should not fix their messes by dispatching young people to die in unnecessary wars. You have well warned about the human cost. So what concerns you most about where this could lead?
So my sense is that President Trump actually understands that he's kind of painted himself in a corner and would like to end this. He sees the impact on his polling, on oil prices, potentially on midterm elections this year. So he's, I think, looking for an off-ramp, but the administration seems to think that it has leverage over Iran when Iran certainly perceives that it has the upper hand. And since the only deal that would actually end the war anytime soon would frankly be a pretty bad deal, and a substantially worse deal than the U.S. could have gotten a month ago, I'm afraid that President Trump will then say, well, you know, to get leverage, we will seize Karg Island, or we will seize the Tunb Islands in the Strait, or we will go after their highly enriched uranium. And you know, these would just be a disaster. They would get us more deeply into this quagmire. They would result in drastic destruction of infrastructure around the region. You know, President Trump's threat today to commit war crimes, including attacking desalination plants in Iran. Well, you know, Iran depends for only 3% of its water on desalination. Some of the other Gulf countries are getting half their water from desalination. So, you know, President Trump is, I fear, headed toward sending ground troops in ways that would be catastrophic for the U.S. and for the world.
So, Rick, not only did we see Trump jokingly, although then he said he wasn't joking about it, but he referred to the Strait of Hormuz as the Strait of Trump. But to reflect in detail what we just heard from Nick, he posted on Truth Social, if the Strait of Hormuz is not immediately open for business, we will conclude our lovely stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants, oil wells, and Karg Island. And again, to Nick's point, possibly all desalination plants, which we have purposely not yet touched. So this strategy of escalating to de-escalate, does that work? Does that translate with Iran?
Well, Alex, as Nick suggested, I mean, and Trump tweeted, I mean, another historic first for President Trump. Never before has an American president threatened war crimes against an adversary in public like that. And it's very, very dangerous. And you know, Nick began his very good column with Vietnam. What we're seeing, and he used the word quagmire, what we're seeing is this kind of escalation escalation to de-escalate, which is probably a Vietnam-era term, that gets us more and more. He's shooting himself in the foot every day. He's getting us more involved, so it's more difficult to extricate. One of the things we've seen over the last 75 years with American foreign policy is it's much easier to seize something and attack something than it is to hold it and protect it. And so he's going down this classic folly that we've seen in Vietnam, we've seen in Iraq, and we've seen in Afghanistan. And all of the things, by the way, that he campaigned against with the endless wars in the Middle East. Now he's gotten us into another one.
I need a very quick answer from you on this, Rick, because he never has indicated he wanted to keep a presence in Iran, right? Can you envision him pulling out? And what would that do?
Well, I mean, as an American, I would say, yes, do pull out, because there aren't any good consequences really to remaining in. He's never outlined what his goal is, what the objective is. I mean, the one virtue of that is you can leave and declare victory and people will go, okay, well, we never knew what you were there for anyway. So risking American troops, risking American blood and treasure for reasons that have never been explicated or sold to the American people, that's a dangerous route.